Welcome, everyone. My name is Jess, and I am co-founder and principal consultant at Healing Equity United. We are really excited to see you all here today, talking about the intersection between race and sexual violence. As always, we want to start off with a land acknowledgement. And this land acknowledgement was specifically written in partnership with one of our Native American sisters. We like to start off today by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of the lands that we are on, even though we're meeting in a virtual space. Healing Equity United is on the lands of the Muwekma, Ohlone, Piscataway, and unceded Duwamish Territory lands. We'd like to take a moment to recognize that we have and continue to benefit from the use and occupation of this land since even before the United States was formed as a nation. And while the numbers vary, in 1492, there were approximately 100 million Indigenous peoples throughout the Americas already living here. Today, unfortunately, there are only 6.8 million Indigenous peoples left in the US and 574 federally recognized tribes. We recognize the historic discrimination and the violence that have been inflicted upon Indigenous peoples in the Americas, which have included their forced removal from ancestral lands, as well as the deliberate and systematic destruction of their communities and their culture, which continues to today. So please join me in a moment of reflection to acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past and the present, and to consider how we are and can each in our own way try to move forward to dismantle the continued oppression of Indigenous communities. Thank you.
I would like to also share acknowledgement that this is Women's History Month. And so March, as you know, is Women's History Month, and March 8th in particular was International Women's Day. And this is a time to honor and celebrate women's contributions to history, to raise awareness against bias and discrimination, and to take action for gender equity. Across the world, women are increasingly being recognized as more vulnerable to climate change impacts than men. Women constitute the majority of the world's population that experience poverty and are more dependent on natural resources, which climate change threatens the most. In striving for gender equity, we must also take into account intersectionality. According to the 2020 US Census, a Black man and a white woman make 74 cents and 78 cents, respectively, to a white man's dollar. Black women, faced with multiple forms of oppression, only make 64 cents. Intersectionality recognizes that identity markers, e.g., women and Black, do not exist independently of each other, and that each informs the others, often creating a complex convergence of oppression. Feminism without intersectionality is just white supremacy. This month and beyond, consider the ways that you can leverage your privileged identities to support, uplift, and be in solidarity with the women, particularly women of color and of other historically marginalized identities, who are part of the spaces that you occupy. Thank you.
So we want to take a moment and introduce ourselves. We also have our panelists here today, whom we'll be introducing you all to a little bit later. And so I'll start. My name is Jess, and I'm a first-generation immigrant. I came to the US when I was about 4 years old. My parents were afraid of what would happen when Hong Kong, which was a British colony at the time, was turned back over to China. And so my parents, who were growing up low income and made it to the middle class in Hong Kong, chose to go back into poverty when we immigrated to New York City. As the eldest child in my family, I was the first to go to school. I took ESL classes in elementary school and became the de facto interpreter and translator for both of my parents. And it's a role that I still play to this day. I saw a lot of community violence and domestic violence in my community. As kids, we would talk about it on the playgrounds. And that was really the impetus for me wanting to do domestic violence work when I started working in the nonprofit sector. And so Fiona and I met about 12 years ago when I was running a domestic violence nonprofit in Washington, DC. and I moved out to the Bay Area where I currently reside a couple of years ago to work specifically on sex trafficking issues. I'm currently residing in Oakland, California with my partner, who is a community organizer in Oakland, Chinatown, and our two dogs, Hanson and Kobe. And Hanson is actually my service dog because I live with an invisible disability. Really happy to be here with you today. And I'll turn it over to my colleague, Fiona, to tell you a little bit more about herself.
Hi, I'll keep my introduction brief because I want you all to get to the meat of today's conversation. So I'm a first-generation Jamaican American. Folks in my family range from being completely undocumented to naturalized citizens. And so growing up, I really saw day to day the impact of the oppression that immigrants face in this society, particularly those without documentation. Having said that, I'm a US citizen, and so there's a lot of power and privilege that goes along with that identity. I am an attorney barred in New York and Washington, DC, another identity that holds a lot of power and privilege in this society. I was born and raised in the South Bronx of New York City, which is a community that's primarily Black and Brown, higher rates of poverty, of drug use, of criminal activity, but higher rates of love and support. And that's what helped me to become the person I am today. I'm married to a cisgender white male who is an immigrant from Europe. So we talk about male privilege, racism, his privilege as a white man. We have 3 children who are biracial, half Black, half white. My eldest identifies as a Black woman with a white father. Cassie?
Thanks, Fiona. Hi, everyone. My name is Cassie Whitebread. I use she, her pronouns. I identify as second generation Chinese American. I also identify as mixed race or biracial. I'm native to New Jersey, though I call Philadelphia home. That's where I went to grad school, and I used to be a middle school science teacher there. I currently live in Seattle, Washington, and when I'm not doing this work currently with Healing Equity United, I work for a nonprofit called Seattle Works as their education director. And we'd love to also know who's in the space with us today. So please introduce yourself in the chat to the panelists here. Feel free to share your name, organization, any key identities such as pronouns or racial or ethnic identities that feel important to you. And a few words about tech as those identities are coming in, as you're sharing those with the panelists. We are in webinar format, and so we've disabled the chat to everyone to keep the space safe. We will be sending out a recording afterwards, and feel free to put any questions that come along during the webinar into the Q&A so that we can keep track, as there will be a Q&A section towards the end. I see some folks are introducing themselves to the panelists here. We've got some folks from Central Oregon, Central Ohio. I see some folks who are working currently in the DV sector. Someone from Crisis Center in Moab, Utah. From Michigan, Sexual Assault Forensic Program. Many folks are identifying with she, her pronouns. Some folks who identify as advocates within the sexual assault sector. Thank you so much for sharing with us. We'd love to see those to continue to keep coming in.
Great, thank you. So glad that you're all here to join us today. So I wanted to start by sharing, waking up today was really difficult for me. Today is the 1-year anniversary of the Atlanta spa shootings, where we know 8 individuals were massacred, 6 of whom were Asian women. The misogyny and racism that's been faced by Asian and Asian American women has long been hidden and ignored. Our pain and our suffering has been called many things: an attack, murder, exoticism, and we've been told that it's our fault, that we deserve it for looking a certain way or working in a certain profession. And what I also want to share is that I know that there are survivors among us on this webinar. And today is a day where not only are we going to reflect on what happened in Atlanta, but also take a stand that we're no longer going to be silenced. So before we begin, I'm going to ask that we all take a moment of silence now to remember and honor all of the victims of the spa shootings and to know that their deaths were not in vain. Thank you. So as I mentioned earlier, today is a day of reflection, and we ask that you join us in raising awareness about not just violence inflicted on our communities, but also about the intersections of race and sexual violence, because our shared struggle is against white supremacy, misogyny, and racism towards people of the global majority. And after our panel today, we ask that you take a moment to consider how you can be an ally or a co-conspirator as we all move towards collective solidarity. Thank you. And turn it over to my colleague, Fiona, now.
Thank you, Jess. I appreciate it. And so just to set the groundwork about why we are coming together, Healing Equity United is a project that Jess and I created to support individuals and organizations to move beyond awareness regarding oppression to actually taking action to dismantle systems, to interrupt oppression, to shift our culture. And we come from a space where we truly believe that all forms of oppression are interconnected. And so for us, it was obvious to have, to see the need to have a conversation regarding the intersections between sexual violence and racism, right? In our work, we typically do baseline assessments for organizations to determine where they are in the spectrum of creating cultures of belonging or not. We provide comprehensive trainings, we provide technical assistance, but every so often we have to come together just to have conversation, because these conversations are often done individually and in a siloed fashion. And so we thought it was very important to invite our panelists into this space to have this conversation and to share this information and their insights with you. And so I'd like to take a moment to first thank our panelists and to introduce them briefly. So first we have Kate, and Kate is a partner at Reframe Health and Justice Consulting. She has been a longtime sex worker rights advocate with a focus on economic justice, anti-policing and incarceration, and public health. You can see more about her bio in the information that we sent out to y'all previously, but I want to create more space for conversation. Next up, we have Sarah, and Sarah is the Director of Programs at the Asian Pacific Institute on Gender-Based Violence. She oversees coordination and administration of all aspects of government, public and privately funded API GBV programs. Again, you can see more about her bio on the site. And last but certainly not least, we have Zoe. And Zoe has been working in the field to support survivors of domestic and sexual violence since 2004. Has a focus on healing. And again, you can see her bio on the site. And so we know that women of the global majority, BIPOC women, Black, Indigenous, people of color, women, have often been impacted by the existing biases and stereotypes that are out there, right? There are stereotypes about Asian women in terms of being submissive or being quote unquote exotic. Stereotypes about Latinas, about being spicy and fiery and sex pots, about Black women, about being hypersexualized and having no agency over their own bodies, about Indigenous women, right? We know the statistics that correlate to that, right? Like that Indigenous women are 2 times more likely to experience rape than non-Hispanic white women in this society. That more than 1/2 of them have experienced sexual violence in their lifetime. We know the horrific stats that correlate to each of those subsections of women of the global majority. And so we wanted to open up the conversation to the panel to just dive a bit deeper. And so I have a series of questions for y'all. But before we get started, I'd like to give the panelists an opportunity to just provide some foundational information to ground today's conversation. And so I'm going to go in order of folks on my screen. And so Kate, that means you're up first.
Hi, thank you so much. And thank you for putting this on. Thank you for having this conversation. And thanks to everyone who came here to be part of this conversation today. I guess just to kind of situate my comments and my thinking, and especially what's really present for me today, you know, first and foremost, Atlanta and what happened a year ago is really just heavy on my heart today. I've been a very long time sex worker organizer. I am a queer mixed race identified person, Asian and white, and you know the way that so many of these things came together in Atlanta to really show surface a story that was happening under the surface for so long. It is really present, and I'm actually at an anti-trafficking conference right now, so that is also very present for what I'm thinking about. And the 2 things that kind of came to mind for where I want to ground myself is first off that, you know, thinking about how each of these intersections are so unique. And what happened was the intersection of race and of gender and of gender-based violence, but also of class and of the way that those stories not just come together in a unique way and are part of a unique narrative, but also what is the role that this narrative plays in white supremacy? What is the role that this story about submissive Asian women who work in massage parlors, that was a part of this story. What is the role that that plays in not just encouraging violence, but encouraging violence in our responses to violence? And what is the role of that story in encouraging intervention, encouraging vigilantes, encouraging the story of what is good and what is bad and who needs to be rescued and whose bodies are disposable, and how each of those narratives are unique and they each play a contributory part of the violence of white supremacy. The other thing that's really coming up for me today is thinking a lot about not just the story of Atlanta, but the story of the response to Atlanta and the stories and the pieces that were left out. I think so many times when we think about these narratives and how we want to fight stereotypes and the stereotypes of sexualization and fetishization of Asian women and Asian women who work in proximity and are stereotyped to be part of the sex industry and what that means and how we react to those things and how we tell a story about who deserves violence and who does not and who is left out of that narrative as well. And thinking about, you know, not just these stereotypes and reacting to those stereotypes, but also what happens when you show up and you really are part of that stereotype. And what does it take to create spaces where we reject those narratives of what is assumed about us so fully that we are actually able to show up as our full selves. And we are able to show up in the ways that say, I reject this narrative in such a complete way. All of these stereotypes I reject so completely that I am willing to show up as a person who might, if you embrace that stereotype, reinforce it. And what does it mean to be a sexualized person? What does it mean to be in proximity to the sex trade? What does it mean to be in proximity to that stereotype? And how do we create a space where even that is acceptable. And even those bodies, even those stories, even those narratives in those communities still do not deserve violence. And so that is what I am sitting in today. And thank you.
Wow. Thank you so much, Kate. I had myself on mute, but I was just wholeheartedly agreeing with everything that you just shared. So thank you. Sarah, I would like to invite you to also give your opening remarks.
I guess starting with wow, thank you, Kate. I think you said it all. You really did. So thank you for that. And I guess where I want to ground myself today also is it's a 1-year anniversary today for the Atlanta shootings. Yesterday was the 3-year anniversary for the Christchurch shootings in New Zealand. Sitting a little bit with that, but if we look at, and the reason why I'm also on this panel is that I love the fact that we're talking about the global BIPOC majority rather than just focusing on the US, although that's where we all are. So, but I am an immigrant and I do bring that lens. And I think one of the grounding things that I would like us to start with, and I don't know if I'm preaching to the choir, first of all, is I do identify as Asian, which is not typically the look that you think of me when you think of Asian. I'm South Asian, but I also want to say that I don't speak for all Asians, and I definitely don't speak on behalf of our sisters from Hawaii, Native sisters, and also from the Pacific Islander territories. But what I will do is hold up stories that some of our fantastic staff and other culturally specific folks on the ground have shared, just because it's kind of impossible to represent half the world, which is all of Asia, although the US tends to pick and choose which part of Asia is represented in the Asian continent. Some things that I'm sitting with is that gender-based violence, of which sexual violence is a huge part of, is it's across the lifespan, right? There are no isolated incidents, especially for BIPOC communities. Nothing is coincidental, and there are multiple perpetrators. Besides the stereotypes, gender-based violence is also a transnational public health human rights issue. It is not just a woman's issue, which totally leaves out people who do not identify as part of a cisgender community otherwise. And I want to call out that oppression occurs even within our own movement. With our victim survivors, with advocates, with leadership for people that are not able-bodied, for LGBTQ, bicultural, multilingual communities, and all the people that are kind of named, and I'm sure I've left out a lot, must navigate multiple levels of oppressions, from workplace violence and microaggressions to being underfunded, heavily scrutinized by funders, and also our bodies are always out there for folks to comment on. What else did I want to talk about? We wanted to acknowledge the fact there's a challenge of having conversations about toxic masculinity when it is mostly women or people who identify as women. And I think I will stop there or pause there for now.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you for diving deeper in terms of the interconnectedness of varied oppressions and the spaces, specifically naming the spaces where it shows up and manifests. Zoe, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Fiona. Thank you, Jess. So hi, everyone. I'm Zoe Flowers, and my pronouns are she and her. And I just want to say that I'm calling in from Connecticut, which is the original lands of the Podunk people, the Narragansett, and many, many more. So I think the first thing I want to do is just ask us to take a breath, because there's a lot happening. There's always a lot happening, but I just want to invite us to just take a breath for a moment, just inhaling in and exhaling out, and just taking a moment to acknowledge ourselves for showing up anyway. We continue to show up in the face of everything that's happening. So go ahead and open your eyes and just throughout this call, throughout the rest of the day, just take a moment, I would say, to just bring yourself back in and just acknowledge yourself, because we're so good at looking outward and acknowledging others, and we often forget about what's happening with us, which I think is associated with some of the things I'm going to talk about. so gosh, what's sitting with me today, which is actually surprising, is that I started my work in Atlanta at the coalition in 2000. And I think about the things that we didn't talk about and the things that we still don't talk that much about in the domestic violence space in particular is what I'm talking about, because that's what I'm, most familiar with. And I think about the judgment and the lack of advocacy that we gave with people who are engaging in sex work, with other racial groups, ethnic groups, the judgment and the way we expected other community partners to do that work and other agencies to do that work, and how fragmented we were and still are, I think, in our domestic violence advocacy. And so when I think about the why, I'm wondering if it's because of the lack of attention to healing ourselves, to addressing our traumas, to the reluctance to meaningfully address the racism, the anti-Blackness, the xenophobia that is inherent and rampant in this movement, domestic violence, sexual assault, and social change, period, right? So that when we talk about things like really advocating for people who are doing sex work, it feels like something extra. When I'm working with programs, when I'm working with coalitions, and we start talking about healing and justice, and we start talking about equity, and people say things like, well, is this in alignment with our movement, with our organization? And they start talking about mission drift, right? There is this sort of disconnection about the way that all of our oppressions are linked. And it reminds me of when the Women of Color Network started doing their first national call to actions, and somebody to address the racism and things like that were happening in the movement. And somebody said, it's like we're all fighting for the same 25 cents. And so I think that's why this convening and working with Jess and Fiona and Cassie these past couple of months has been so important for me, is because we don't get the opportunity to work this way. And I think it's so important for those of us in the global majority to really commit to working this way and having these conversations with each other, because that is, I think, where our power lies to actually make the changes that we want to see in this work, because the way it's the way it's been, it's not happening. So yeah, that's what I'm sitting with. I'm sitting with a lot. And again, I just am glad to be in this in these squares with y'all.
Thank you, Zoe. Thank you all. But Zoe, what you were just mentioning in terms of, we don't often have the space to have these conversations and highlight these intersections. As we all say in the movement, right? The system isn't broken. It works the way it was intended to work, exactly. Right? It works the way it was created to work. And so, I might be one of those persons that wear the tinfoil hats and sees conspiracies everywhere. But I really do think that the way that things are set up is set up in a way to keep our populations, the folks we work with in community, siloed, so that we don't come together to lift up our collective power. So let's see if we can dive into it a little bit deeper. So approaches to survivor services programs, outreach, they're all typically siloed, focusing exclusively either on sexism and or misogyny, right? They're presented as completely unrelated to other manifestations of systemic oppression. And as a sector, can each of you tell us a bit about how we might better shift the work to acknowledge the impact of the other forms of oppression on our work, particularly that of racism? And this time I'll start with Sarah. I think that Sarah is having some tech issues, so I'm going to move on to Zoe.
Thanks, Fiona. I'm thinking about the need to document. I'm thinking about we need to document our stories. We need to, whether that's writing, whether that's co-writing books together, whether that's creating short films, we need to document our presence in this movement. We need to document our strategies to let people know that we exist and we have ideas and that our ideas are important. So I think that storytelling and documenting and centering that, which is so based in also Indigenous practices and things like that, we need to start going back to some of those things.
Thank you, Zoe. Kate?
Much agreed on the storytelling. And I think that framing this as saying, it feels like everyone's fighting for the same 25 cents. I think that's really true. I think many of our services are operating from such a scarcity model. And that is intentional. I think that's entirely intentional. I think that you're right. I think that the system is operating in the way that it is meant to operate. And so when we're looking at things like funding, when funding streams come down for culturally competent and culturally humble services, are we talking about Black-led programs, or are we talking about the program in the white-led organization that sets aside a once a month working group to talk about BIPOC issues? And that kind of structure of setting up, hey, getting the money that our services need generally to operate this programming, are we cutting other service providers out because we don't actually have an awareness of our boundaries? Are we trying to serve everyone under the lens that we have because we think our program's great, we just want to make it bigger, we just want to serve everyone, but without a recognition that sometimes that's actually not appropriate, and what people need is an abundance of choices for their healing. And that starts with us operating from a place of abundance. And I know that that's really hard when we really are fighting for, what is state funding that is not enough. And so I think having a very honest conversation about what are the ways that we can operate from abundance, with the recognition that every single survivor, yes, gender-based violence has gender in the title, but that does not mean that every single program that operates should seek to serve every survivor in the same way, because that actually just isn't what survivors need. Survivors and people seeking healing should have such a multitude of choices that are free and accessible and can actually meet people in the way that they want to be seen, and the way that they want to form community to engage in that healing work. We actually have to move into that mindset ourselves, to say that there is abundance and we have to fight for it, and we have to fight for growing the pie and not taking more of the pie that exists. And I think that is both a foundational piece of the way that we look at funding, the way that we look at resourcing. I think the way that we look at what resources are and how we define those things and how we build and form in community in different spaces. And also something that says, if I do this work without uplifting the different spaces that people have, and the different communities and the different experiences and the different identities, if I'm not doing that, then that is not a place of holistic healing for for the people that I want to serve, because sometimes the best way for me to serve them is to actually celebrate and grow a partner and not my program.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And Sarah, I believe you're able to join us.
I think I am. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so I wholeheartedly agree with our panelists, and I also want to uphold the storytelling piece. Documenting orally for a lot of communities, which were our traditions, is a way to do this. I also wholeheartedly agree with moving forward, coming from a place of abundance, not scarcity. In full scarcity. In full disclosure, I am trying very hard personally to get away from this is our deliverable versus this is what our community needs, and these are some of the things we need to do. And a holistic approach is definitely whatever our community says. So doing more of our needs assessment, because on the ground, survivors and community-based organizations that are doing the work are so busy putting out the fires and having to worry about funding and dealing with everything else that is piled on, is for people like us who are in positions of a little bit more power and privilege to have conversations with funders, to ask for more culturally specific services that are not tied to funding, to uplift the work that our community is doing. We all are coming from places of generational trauma. So healing has to happen first for us to even think about stopping, ending the violence, which is just going to keep perpetuating otherwise. And I feel that one way of doing it, which was something that I learned when I came here, when people were, I'm a very literal person, and when I came here, I learned that, you need to be an important partner, you need to be invited to a table, you need to have a seat at the table. That's sharing of power. And if you don't have a seat, you bring a chair. And I remember one time I asked my mentor, I was like, what if we don't sit at tables? Like, what if there is that concept did not exist? Then what? And then I started learning more about building the power of the margins. What if we diffuse the center and let our communities, which are on the edges, kind of build the collective power? And for that, all of us have to work together. It can't just be for an Asian community or Native community or Black, Indigenous, Latina community, whatever, BIPOC community.
Thank you. Thank you. I really appreciate that, because at least from my perspective, it's a great segue into the next question that I had for you all. So Sarah, stay unmuted, because I'm going to let you start that one, since you just went into that area. So what are some strategies that you would propose that would promote solidarity amongst people of the global majority, as well as aspiring allies? And we know that in our sector, aspiring allies take up most of the leadership, right?
Mm-hmm.
And in large part drive some of this work. So what are some strategies around promoting solidarity amongst those folks to better identify, interrupt, and or shift the dynamics that we're talking about in terms of the intersections of sexual violence and racism?
Okay. So I think one strategy or example that I can start off with is just for us, BIPOC, for the global majority people, right? If we were not in a system which set up that you are almost white, or we come with our own colonial background and we work together. The past year, if something we have learned is we have learned to organize with other communities of color. If we were all on the same page, coming in and not trying to assimilate and fit into what I think frankly was just like a white world, we would then have felt the pain that the Native, we definitely must have felt. I don't want to speak for everybody, everybody, but understood more how to stand up for our Native communities, how to stand up for our Black communities. Just like now, we're kind of coming together and thinking about language access, language justice. What does it look like? I can stand up and be an ally for the murdered Indigenous women. You know, you mentioned yourself, they're raped and hurt twice the amount that other people are. I think one big strategy is for us to not lump all BIPOC community, and this is also speaking to the allies, as one community. Like I will speak for the API community. If we separate the South Asians from, say, the East Asians, from, say, the Southeast Asians, you'll see a huge difference in education level, in poverty level, in the way people face violence. South Asians might face more domestic violence. Southeast Asians will talk more about being refugees and being raped then. And then if we take it to the territories, I think one way I want to also bring up that sexual violence and exploitation in Hawaii and the territories is directly tied to the dominance and militarization and tourism of the Pacific, industries that are led and catered to white cis capitalist men. And so one example of how people can be allies is that local Hawaii advocates always talk about advocating against the Rim of the Pacific exercise. I think the abbreviation, because all of us do abbreviations, is RIMPAC, which is the world's largest international maritime warfare exercise. Now, we know what war does, but anyways, this is held biannually during June and July in Hawaii. And then, like, from any large gatherings of men, I think our mainland folks will understand Super Bowl or oil fields. The cases of sexual assault and exploitations jump. Even though RIMPAC says that no service members will leave their ships, but the Navy, like, people end up leaving the ship, and then so that is one place where you could, like, stand up and be like, okay, how do we then kind of make sure that victims and survivors have safe avenues to come, and that we offer sexual and reproductive health education and conversations about what healthy, equitable relationships are, and especially for people when they leave the islands where they face nothing but dominance. That could be one example that I'll leave with, and leave the panel to talk about the others.
Thank you, Sarah. I'll pop it over to Zoe.
Thank you so much, Sarah. You were saying so many things that I was actually thinking. So these strategies to promote solidarity. So one thing I have is reconnecting to our sacred traditions as viable forms of healing, and, you know, personally, individually, and then in our organizations. There's such a disconnect to many of our sacred traditions, and we just go into these mainstream organizations and just begin to take on their ways of knowing and their ways of being in the world. And I just feel like it really is not, you know, I mean, of course there's value in some of the things, but our traditions, our healing strategies have value too. So I think investigating those and bringing those forth is critical. Identifying ourselves as members of the global majority and stop saying BIPOC, right? Because, you know, to me, that was like working with Cassie, and she brought it up that this is the language that you and Jess are moving towards. And ever since then, I've been saying it. It's like, yeah, we are the global majority. And so what does that mean if you identify yourself as the majority and disallow people to call you minorities or lumping you into some BIPOC thing, right? So I think that asserting ourselves and asserting our power is critical. But again, I think that there's a certain level of healing that we need to do to be able to have the self-confidence to identify that. So it's not shying away from our power and our leadership and entrepreneurship. I feel like turning away from some of these organizations is oftentimes the best thing for us. So becoming entrepreneurs, taking our destinies into our own hands, I think is critical. which means there have to be some community support around that, because there is a certain level of like, you know, being like, I don't want to work for you anymore, right? So I understand that. So there needs to be some support there, but I think entrepreneurship is like the way to go. And also interrogating our models. So to incorporate more spiritual and cultural practices. So as somebody who's been doing prevention work for a really long time, we have the social ecological model that I loved and touted for a long time. I still love it, but I started really looking at it and I developed something different called the cultural spiritual ecological model. So it weaves spirituality and culture into it. So I think not being afraid to expand on these models and rigorously interrogating them and putting them out into the world, saying, look, this is our model. We're going to use this from now on. So your model's fine, but we're going to do this over here as well. So I think doing that. And then for aspiring allies, you know, support our efforts with funding. I mean,
Yeah.
period. I mean, period.
Thank you. And I'm gonna follow up with the panel with Zoe's last comment. I'm gonna follow up with the panel after Kate has an opportunity to share her thoughts.
Yeah, I love that. And I'm 100% going to follow up around the incorporation of spiritual and cultural practices of healing. I think one thing about solidarity, and really speaking from a space of API organizing, you know, one thing, first and foremost, it is understanding that the model minority myth is a tool of anti-Blackness. And we actually just have to confront that, discuss it, recognize it, and release it and give it up. And then I think beyond that, so often we really pull apart interpersonal violence and state and cultural violence. And we talk about one, and we don't talk about the other. And we, especially in spaces of intimate partner violence and domestic violence, it becomes this exclusively interpersonal experience that, of course, it ends up being a gendered conversation that is divorced from all these other pieces. But I think really actually integrating that anti-violence work, by the time we've gotten to intimate partner violence, by the time we've gotten to familial violence, we have learned and lived in systems of violence from day one. And so, you know, when Sarah mentions healthy, equitable relationships, how do we actually understand a healthy, equitable relationship when we've grown up in a space understanding colonization, and when we've grown up in a space of white supremacy and racial hierarchy? And if that is our foregrounding, then of course we accept unhealthy, problematic, oppressive interpersonal relationships, because that is what we've learned as natural, as normal. And, you know, the first place that we probably learn that violence, or maybe not the first, but one of the primary places that we learn that violence is acceptable for punishment. If you don't like what someone does, you can punish them with violence. That is the carceral system. If we know that police and prisons are the place that they hold in society are as the arbiters of violence, and that is the way that we have laws and protect laws and we create safety, then of course you learn that as a parent you can hit your child. Of course you learn that your partner is allowed to hit you if you anger them enough, and that is justified, and that is acceptable, and that is natural, and that is normal, because it's completely unquestioned everywhere else. And so I think that the more that we connect interpersonal spaces as simply manifestations of the cultural lessons of violence and oppression that we swim in like fish, then I think we can begin to actually say, no, we are doing anti-violence work that is not just prevention about teaching that consent matters. It's about living into an ethic of consent and liberation and anti-oppression from the day that we are born. And we reject violence so wholly that we reject it in every single aspect of what we do and how we interact with each other.
Thank you all for that. And I want to just follow up on that and make it a bit more targeted. What can the white identified folks watching this webinar, working in the space of sexual violence, gender-based violence, what specifically can they do to shift their service provision, to shift how they allocate funding, to shift how they work in community with folks of the global majority, what specifically can they do? And I will leave it to any of you to just unmute first.
I unmuted because I know the other two are going to be so much more profound. But when you said this, I'm just sharing the first thought that came to my head. And I know you said specifically for white allies, but this is a call to action for all of us. Can we recognize our own internal biases? So when I look at a Latina walking in, is she spicy? These are to your words, Fiona. An Asian walking in, is she submissive? And Black girls as young as 7 or 8, how can anyone be hypersexualized at that age, right? It starts there. It starts with all of us within us. And I think it's a question that our allies need to ask themselves. Why is the burden of educating our allies always on us? I think, so I'll just let the other two say it.
Thank you, Sarah. Kate or Zoe?
I can go. I'm thinking about, interrogating their connections to white supremacy and how they benefit from it beyond book clubs. Like, how am I aligning in this work? How am I undermining this Black advocate? How am I silencing this Indigenous community with my policies and procedures, and really get real with that and make real changes? And I read this this piece the other day, and they said about the anti-Blackness in the movement, and it said that these organizations quote Audre Lorde, but none of them want her as their executive director. I was like, yes, the truth. So it's like, interrogate that and then do something about it.
I love that. And I'm gonna definitely cite that. I love it.
Yeah, I'll send you the article.
Thank you, Kate.
That's perfect. And yeah, I mean, so many amazing things have been said, and co-sign all of them. And I think, going to the folks, the global majority is obviously not a monolith. BIPOC is not a monolith. And so I think just in the day-to-day, like, who are the folks around you who you trust, who you can go to and just say, like, how can I show up for you? What is the thing that you need so that in my community, in this immediate space, I trust you and I want to be your co-conspirator. I want to be your ally. I don't know how to show up for every single person in the global majority, but in my community, you are an organization, you are a community group, you are a community leader who I trust and deeply respect. How can I show up for you better?
Thank you all for that. And I have one more question, but I do want to remind folks who are watching to please take advantage of our Q&A, because we're going to be turning to your questions next, right? So start typing, flood that Q&A box. But before we get to those, let me pose my last question to the panel. So can each of you take a moment to discuss the intersection of toxic masculinity and racism, given what we know about varied privileged identities? And any of you can lead. Or I can call on someone.
Can you say it again?
Yeah. So take a moment to discuss the intersection of toxic masculinity and racism, given what we know about varied privileged identities. So we know, for example, the racial identity of the shooter last year, a year ago, right? We know his quote unquote explanation, right? Um, how does that all come together? What's that about?
Okay. From time immemorial, man, and I use that term very specifically, or a tribe or whoever has come into this world thinking they are better than the others, whether it is the female sex and or other communities that the global majority that look a certain way. And what that means is your women are pure, everyone else isn't. So you can do as you please and treat them any which way that you can. So if we talk about slavery, it's okay to rape women, ignore their kids, but God forbid if someone from the, people, a Black man looked at a white woman, that's mayhem right there. Rape, we all know, is used as a tool of war, has been used forever. I don't know why, but hymens are linked to honor, for men's honor for whatever reason. So that means that you can go around raping with impunity. War gives you a reason to do that. And then that means you are kind of killing this or diluting the blood of people who are not equal to you. How does that tie into toxic masculinities? Exactly this way. When you're raised with, I can do whatever, in India, catcalling is called Eve teasing. There's nothing teasing about it. You are been through it. You are touched, you are prodded. People call out all sorts of things to you when you are not even a teenager yet, because you have the privilege, you have the male privilege of knowing you can get away from that. And that sort of toxic masculinity, and when taken to prisons, when we're not even talking, so I spoke about using rape as a instrument of torture. It's not just for women, but it is also for men, which is then adds on that extra level of humiliation. And we saw that play out last year. We see that play out every year. We also saw that, I'm not talking about an Asian person. I think of so many instances, but there was definitely last year, I want to say, a 41-year-old Black man. He died in Rochester, New York, in police custody. That therein was, toxic masculinity. What makes you think that people, when people are killed intentionally because they can, what makes us take some people to Burger King to feed them and not listen to other people who say we can't breathe? That is toxic masculinity.
Thank you, Sarah. Either Kate or Zoe?
I think Sarah really named it. I think the intersection is that toxic masculinity is not, it's present. And just like gender-based violence, it is present uniquely in every single other identity, and they don't excuse each other. And I think that recognizing that they don't excuse each other and that they cannot be untangled from each other, that if we break down race, if we name it as, this invented taxonomy that is manifesting in violence, then we inherently have to do the same thing with gender, and that they are not mutually exclusive to each other. And so I think the most important intersection for me is just a recognition that that these oppressions are all interlinked, but so is their unlearning, and so is the recognition that they all create their unique forms of violence, But, you know, much like a sweater, if you pull a thread, things will inherently dismantle as we dismantle one. And so, you know, recognizing that the intersection of their violence is true also means that we can recognize that the intersection of their healing is true as well.
Thank you, Kate. Zoe?
Yeah, I love that sweater and that thread, because what I was thinking about with this is sort of one of the roots of this is religious doctrine for me. And so if you put the male as God, the Father, the Son, the Holy Ghost, and everything under that has to be secondary: women, children, the earth, the animals, everything. And so because they're God, they can, you know, take what did the man say? Who shall remain nameless? America's father. I could bring you in and I can take you out, right? That's like true. That's what they believe. So that's what I was thinking. But so I feel like there's something there with that that making themselves God, and a white God. So yeah, and yeah, so but that thread piece, it's like, okay, so if we can begin to dismantle some of those beliefs or attachments to those doctrines, maybe some of these other things we can unravel as well, maybe.
Thank you all. And so we have some questions in the Q&A. I'm gonna pitch it over to Cassie to share some of those questions.
Thanks, Fiona. The first question that we had come in: what do you think about interrogating the narrative regarding the value of women's work, especially mothers? It seems to me that fathers don't experience the same pay gaps that mothers do, even as single fathers.
I love this question because I think one of the other things that we need to talk about more is anti-capitalism and the way that capitalism, as it is, modern capitalism especially, is so completely predicated and built on a system of devaluing women's work, and that the way that we construct value is exclusively based on, you know, traditionally masculine labor. And now we're talking about things like feminized labor in these different ways. And granted, like, I'm at an anti-trafficking conference, and so having a lot of these conversations about like feminized labor sectors, which even when we say that, what we don't talk about is all of the unpaid and unvalued domestic work that has always supported a capitalist system. And now we're talking about feminized labor forces because we're talking about paid labor forces. And until we actually talk about the ways that capitalism, yes, it's a system, it's a monetary system, but it is a very, it is a monetary system with values. And part of those values are absolute gender-based violence in the form of erasure and dehumanization of everything that women have been expected to do, and only caring about labor, only caring about feminized labor forces when that is meaning, hey, women are displacing men, and only valuing women in traditionally male identified workplaces. And so yes, we need to talk about women's labor, and I think we need to talk about it within. We have built a system of white supremacy, we have built a system of patriarchy, we have built a system of capitalism and ableism that is an incredibly gendered and historically gendered space. And we need to unravel and unpack that and have conversations about also the ways that economic violence is not just a product of domestic violence, but it is contributing extensively to domestic and intimate partner violence.
Thank you, Kate. I see some snaps from Zoe. What do you want to add?
I have nothing.
All right. Sarah, do you have anything that you wanted to add on that one? Okay, terrific. Kathy?
Yeah, our next question: what can white leaders address in the workplace when supervising people of the global majority, especially when having hard conversations, i.e. addressing productivity, managing expectations, etc.? I think of equality versus equity and how a leader's efforts should reflect the different needs of different people, but also want to avoid tokenism and being and placating or being indirect. Our organization has struggled with this recently.
While our panelists think about this answer, I will just share from Healing Equity United's perspective. Reach out for help. I mean, Healing Equity United didn't get created because, on a whim. It was because we saw a need out there, particularly of white leaders in this space, to figure out what to do. Everybody has the best, quote unquote, best of intentions, right? But then they don't know how to follow through on those best intentions. And so reach out for support on how to normalize conversations and even reframing. It's like, is it a hard conversation? Who's it a hard conversation for? It might be a challenging conversation, it might be a nuanced conversation, but why is that a hard conversation? And managing whose expectations, right? Are you managing your expectations? Are you managing your expectation? And I don't know who posed the question, and this is not meant in a facetious way, but managing our expectations as white leaders, I'm not white, but in terms of how I expect folks to show up, what I deem as professional or not, how I respond to those non-traditional ideas around service provision and outreach that folks of the global staff of the global majority bring to me. And I say, well, that's not what we've done. Well, that's not best practice. Well, there's no research behind that and we can't push that forward. Like, I would suggest first a reframing of those issues. And when in doubt, reach out for help. Like, that's why Healing Equity United is here. But for the three of you, do you have more specific responses for them?
I was thinking about, are these conversations also in addition to getting help? Are these conversations that your staff should be engaged in? Meaning, I've always wondered why I got performance reviews and I didn't get to review my supervisor. So, like Fiona said, whose expectations? What are they based on? Right.
Thank you. Any others? Because I see some other questions. So Cassie?
Yes, the next question, first off, they name, thank you so much for this invaluable session. Do you think that the anti-trafficking framework is white male rescuing and obscures the consent, safety, and justice of global majority sex workers?
Yes. And I, there's, as someone who sits in the anti-trafficking movement and really values the partnerships and the interventions and the service providers, I think one of the constant questions in the back of my head is what do you do with fruit from a tree that was rooted in violence? And are there ways to kind of navigate that? And that's what we're all dealing with. How do you do harm reduction from the system is very often the question that we're asking ourselves is when we do service provision, and especially service provision that is grounded in anti-violence when navigating a system that was rooted in carcerality and interventions that were rooted in carcerality. The history of the anti-trafficking movement is really, it began as an anti-sex work movement. It became, it was originally about not just sex workers, but especially really a movement about miscegenation, really rooted in this idea that sex work can never be consensual, not just because of economic reasons, but because of the cross-racial mixing that it invites. And the anti-trafficking movement was a way to name that and give that a name. And that was true in its inception in the 1800s. It was true in the early 1900s. And a lot of that inflection still very much exists in especially the way that we promote anti-trafficking interventions abroad. I think as much as we can talk about the US anti-trafficking movement and the violence that is created against sex workers, the way that that has been enforced globally and encouraged globally, and the damage that it has done to sex workers in different parts of the world is immeasurable. And so, yes, I think the framework is problematic and very challenging. And I think we do need to have conversations about exploitation. I think a carceral response to this is often about turning social injustice into ways that we can just toss one person in jail and call it a day. And we need to really think about what it means to address exploitation in a society where exploitation is the foundation and so deeply normalized that one of the biggest problems in doing anti-trafficking work is that you're often dealing with people where the trafficking situation is the best economic situation that they have available. And so I could go on, I'm not going to. Open Democracy is a website that has beyond trafficking and slavery is their anti-trafficking section. They have incredible articles that often really tackle this within a framework of anti-exploitation and anti-oppression. And I cannot recommend it more highly. And their articles are very, very readable and very engaging and talk about a lot of different things. So yes, is my answer to that question. And that space I highly recommend to really dive into some of these nuances.
You. I was gonna say that question had your name written all over it, but give Zoe or Sarah the opportunity to answer it if they would like to. If not, we can move on to the next question. All right, Cassie?
Our next question. How, as a Black woman who works in the community that is similar to the community that you were raised in, share with organizations how to handle the survivors that we serve in a positive way without diminishing them due to lack of understanding of a savior complex?
So I feel like on the one hand, looking for aspiring allies within your organization to raise these conversations, because it depends on how safe your organization is for you to raise these conversations. I don't know that. So if there's some aspiring allies there in your organization that can raise these issues, that would be great. And then also going back to what Fiona said, bringing in outside folks to have some of these conversations is definitely important. But also just like, I know you might not have influence or power around staffing, but this also sounds like a little bit of a staffing issue.
Thank you, Zoe. Kathy?
Next question we had, how can we approach conversations of oppression in cultures and religions that are an integral part of their identity? For an example, in mainstream Christianity, as Zoe brought up, they put men in higher role and oppress women.
I guess, so I guess I just would follow up with, do you mean within your organizations or within your religious communities? For me, I would just start talking about it. That's just me. And refer people to books and historical references and things like that. But maybe, I don't know, my panelists have something else.
I will chime in. I can't speak to mainstream Christianity, but I agree with what Zoe is saying. I think a lot of the interpretation, at least in the previous, when when the books came down, whether it was in the Abrahamic faith, whichever book it was, the Torah, the Bible, or the Quran, the interpretation, everything was done by men. So talk about toxic masculinity. So it is a matter of learning to read yourself, having these conversations. Also, those were the times, and then these are the times. So what changes where? Because the role of the woman and of the man has changed from when the books were written to when it's now. So I think now is the time to have conversations, to work in your faith-based communities where you're already working with, in your communities around gender-based violence, domestic violence, sexual violence, and also trafficking. So how is anybody put in a higher role? I probably were made equal, or should have been made equal. So I think it's a little bit of that reading. Yes, exactly, Zoe, that. Zoe put in the chat that there are also doctrines that uphold equity. So definitely talk about equity.
Thank you. Kathy, I believe we have one more.
No, I believe that was it from the Q&A. Unless there were any in the chat that I had missed. This might be a good time, though, to move into last words from our panelists.
Yeah, so we'd like to, first of all, reiterate our thanks to you all again and give each of you an opportunity to close us out with some thoughts. You brought us into the space, grounding us with some thoughts, and what would you like us to take away from this conversation? I'll start with Zoe first this time.
Yeah, my last thoughts, again, just thank you for the opportunity to have this conversation and just to have faith and know that change is possible, that it takes work, but that change is possible. And I also want to lift up the work that myself and Healing United are engaged in. So is now the right time to do that? Yeah. So if you want more opportunities to have conversations like this and opportunities for healing, we are hosting 2 retreats in Hawaii. And one is for folks of the global majority. So it's a time for us to come together and talk about some of these issues in a beautiful environment. And those dates are September 14th of this year to September 18th of this year. And you'll start to see more information about that in a couple of weeks coming out. And then we have one for aspiring allies, and that one is September 7th of this year to September 11th of this year. So, oh good, Cassie put the save the dates in the chat. So we'd love to see you in Hawaii, and have, it's a dirt bike. It's just dirt bikes, sorry. folks are happy, it's nice out today. So yeah. You have to save the dates, and we'd love to see you in Hawaii.
Thank you, Zoe. Kate.
I also just noticed, Zoe, your background and what it actually is, and that is spectacular. And I think the thing that I want to leave with is primarily just gratitude. Gratitude for all of these thoughts, gratitude for Healing Equity United to put this together, gratitude for everyone who's here and took this time, and the incredible weight of just spending these time together and having these conversations, and the incredible healing of that as well. And I think also to uplift, I think the beauty of discomfort is something we do not celebrate enough. And it's partially it's because we're constantly sitting in pain and hurt, and that healing is harmful, and or healing harm can be painful. And I think figuring out and separating the actual impact of trauma and the discomfort of healing trauma, and recognizing that those are 2 different things, and to uplift just how beautiful it is to sit in a space that is welcoming and encouraging and challenging enough for us to grow is such a glorious thing. And it is the thing that gives me hope and faith.
Thank you so much. So in other words, folks should not shy away from these conversations, right? Yes, thank you,
Yes.
Kate.
What is pain? I think what you said about reframing that conversation, is it a hard conversation or is it a challenging conversation? Is a sentence that I'm gonna keep in the back of my head and promise to credit you with every time.
Sarah, and last but not least.
Oh Lord, those two are such hard acts to follow. Okay, I feel like I keep saying exactly what they said. I will take a moment again to bring us back to the fact that we are here today because of what happened last year. And that we always should remember, we cannot forget that the way forward is remembering and honoring the victims who died last year, March 16th, whose names and stories have become absorbed in the broader struggle for racial justice. They are swept into history as the faces of movement to end of the movement to end API hate. But their participation in this movement was not a choice that they made, nor did their families and friends whose loss have been the greatest. And I say this for everybody from the global majority, all of us who are grieving the loss. It's not a choice that our friends and family made, but it's our goal to uphold it. I think another thing that I want us to think about is we keep saying that while this was not new, the pandemic brought on more hate, but the hate has always been there. So how do we mandate and stop and prevent? Well, I don't know if how much we can stop, but can we prevent violence of all forms? And we know that the way forward is with solidarities within our community, within the global majority. And even though we grieve, we have been really been happy to see that we're kind of coming together and honestly lifting up voices of other communities as well. And I feel that that is the way forward. These are the conversations that we should have been having, but can continue to have now and lift up the need of all people to feel safe in our own homes and communities. Thank you.
Look, you said you couldn't follow that. You follow them up, and you end with such beautiful words. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you to you all for participating, for being on this panel. And I wanted to, and thank you all for attending, those of you who joined. I just wanted to close us out with this quote from Zainab Salbi, and it says, "From joblessness to lack of education and professional, quote unquote, professional skills to sexual and gender-based violence, women face a multifaceted oppression." And if you take anything away from this conversation, I truly hope it is that we can no longer stay in our siloed approach to the work, and that we do have to look at it as a multifaceted issue, one that is interconnected with other manifestations of oppression, and to recognize where our own biases, prejudices, the stereotypes that we cling to about other and those people, how they contribute to the intersections between sexual violence and racism. And so with that, I wanted to just let you know that we are going to be sending a recording of this webinar out to everyone who has registered. And we just thank you all again.